Her hands didn't shake when she set down the wine glass. They shook when she picked up the pen. Maya Thompson, 7 months pregnant, wearing the standard black apron of Jeoeun's most secretive private dining room, stood alone in the supply closet with a folded linen order form and 3 minutes before the next course needed to go out. The note in front of her was her 4th attempt. The first 3 were torn into pieces so small they couldn't be read even if someone found them. She smoothed the paper once with her thumb. Read it back to herself. Folded it along the crease. Then she picked up the tray, pushed through the kitchen door, and walked back into the most dangerous room in Seoul. What the guests at table 1 didn't know, what the man laughing at the far end of the table didn't know, was that the woman refilling the wine glasses had spent 3 months being threatened into silence. And that tonight, she had decided the silence was going to cost more than the truth. Jeoeun Private Dining has no address on any public directory. No reviews. No sign on the door. You are either invited or you do not exist to it. The walls are lacquered black. The lighting is warm and low, the kind designed to make powerful men feel safe. Crystal stemware. White linen. A kitchen staff of 8 who have all signed documents they understand the weight of. And at the center table, in a perfectly tailored black suit with a white shirt and black tie that suggested not wealth but discipline, the kind of man who dresses like a decision, sat Do-hyun Lee, head of the Iron Crane Syndicate, the most controlled man in any room he has ever entered. He was reading the menu when Maya reached his side. She set down the appetizer with the practiced steadiness of someone who had trained herself not to be seen, not to be noticed, not to matter. Then she slid the folded note beneath the edge of his plate with a single fingertip and walked away without looking back. He didn't look up. He didn't react. His hands simply moved, one small, deliberate motion, and covered the note beneath his palm. Maya pushed back through the kitchen door. She pressed her back against the wall beside the pass-through, one hand flat against her pregnant belly, and waited. Here is the first thing you need to understand about courage. It is not the absence of fear. Every great psychologist, every combat veteran, every person who has ever done something genuinely difficult will tell you the same thing. Courage and terror are not opposites. They exist in the same body at the same moment. Maya's heart was slamming so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands were cold. She had not eaten since noon because her stomach had refused everything since the wine cellar. She was terrified. She had done it anyway. Because there is a decision that some people reach, not often, not easily, where the cost of silence finally exceeds the cost of speaking. Where the thing you are protecting by staying quiet becomes worth less than the thing you lose by never acting. Maya had carried this secret for 3 months, through morning sickness and swollen ankles and a shift schedule that kept her on her feet for 10 hours at a time, and tonight she had finally done the math. 4 minutes passed. Then 5. The kitchen hummed. Orders called. Plates going out. And then from the dining room, through the lacquered black door, the sound changed. Not an explosion. Not a scream. Not the crash of furniture or the bark of commands. Something worse. Silence. The particular, absolute, impossible silence of a room full of powerful people who have all understood something at exactly the same moment. Do-hyun Lee had set down his fork. He had looked across the table. And he had said one man's name. Her hands didn't shake when she set down the wine glass. They shook when she folded the note. Maya Thompson stood in the supply closet off the main kitchen corridor, one bare bulb overhead, the smell of clean linen and industrial detergent around her, and looked at the 4th version of a message that could either save a man's life or end hers. 7 months pregnant, back aching from 4 hours on her feet already, apron still damp from a water glass she'd caught before it hit the floor during setup. Her ponytail had come loose on one side. She hadn't fixed it. There hadn't been time, and somewhere between the wine cellar and this closet, vanity had stopped mattering entirely. The first note had been too long. 3 paragraphs of explanation, context, apology. The kind of note a frightened person writes when they need the reader to understand everything at once. She'd torn it the moment she read it back. Desperation has a smell, and powerful men don't respond to it. The second was too vague. A warning without evidence is just noise. She knew that. She'd spent 3 months watching how men like the ones in that dining room processed information, Quickly, skeptically, always looking for the angle. Vague got you dismissed. Vague got you escorted out by security and handed a business card for someone whose job it was to make problems like you disappear quietly. The third she'd torn before she finished it because her hands had started shaking so badly the handwriting was unreadable. The fourth was 22 words. A code name. A time. A location. One sentence that no one outside the Iron Crane's inner circle could have known. Information she had seen on a document she was never supposed to find, in an apartment she was never supposed to be in, belonging to a man who had since made very certain she understood the consequences of remembering it. She read it back once, folded it along a single clean crease, and stood there in the supply closet for a moment longer, her hand flat against the curve of her belly, feeling for the small reliable rhythm of movement that had become, over these 7 months, the one thing that could still her mind when everything else was noise. There was a slow roll, an elbow maybe or a knee. Her child, unbothered, unhurried, entirely unaware that its mother was standing in a closet deciding whether to be brave or sensible. She had tried sensible for 3 months. Sensible had a cost she was no longer willing to pay. Maya picked up the tray, pushed through the closet door, and walked back into the kitchen. Plates going out for the second course. The head chef calling times. The low orchestrated chaos of a high-end kitchen mid-service, everyone moving in the precise choreography of people who cannot afford mistakes. She moved through it without being seen, which was something she had become very good at. Invisible was safe. Invisible was survival. She had learned that the hard way long before she came to Seoul. The kitchen door swung open and the dining room replaced the noise with something else entirely, the curated quiet of serious money. Low light. The clink of crystal. Conversation in the measured register of people who never raise their voices because they have never needed to. Table 1. Do-hyun Lee sat at the center, his posture the kind of still that wasn't passive, it was controlled, the stillness of a man who had made a discipline out of giving nothing away. Black suit, white shirt, black tie. He was listening to something the man on his left was saying with the expression of someone who had already formed their conclusion and was simply allowing the other person to finish. Beside him, Yoon-hee Lee held her wine glass by the stem and looked at nothing in particular with eyes that catalogued everything. And at the far end of the table, refilling his own glass because that was the kind of man he was, laughing at something no one else had laughed at, Kang Seo-jin. Maya did not look at him. She had trained herself out of that reflex weeks ago. Looking meant reacting, and reacting meant being seen, and being seen by Seo-jin in this room, tonight of all nights, was the one thing she absolutely could not afford. She reached Do-hyun's side, set down the appetizer plate with her left hand, and with her right, in a motion so small it was invisible to anyone not watching for it, slid the folded note beneath the edge of the plate and withdrew her hand. He didn't look up. He didn't react. His hand moved once, a single, deliberate shift, and covered the note beneath his palm. Maya walked back to the kitchen, pushed through the door, pressed her back against the wall beside the pass-through and closed her eyes. She had no idea if she had just saved his life. She had a very clear idea of what happened to people who crossed Seo-jin and failed. For minutes passed. Then 5. The kitchen moved around her, indifferent. And then, from the other side of the door, the sound of the dining room changed. Not loud. Not sudden. The opposite. Silence. Complete, total, and absolute. The kind that doesn't happen by accident in a room full of powerful people. The kind that means every person in it has understood something at exactly the same moment. Maya opened her eyes. Her hand was still on her belly. Her child rolled once, slow and steady, like a question being asked in a language she was only beginning to understand. Jeoun did not exist. Not officially. Not publicly. Not in any directory, review platform, or business registry that an ordinary person might consult. There was no sign on the door, just a brushed steel panel beside a black lacquered entrance on a side street in Gangnam that most people walked past without slowing down, because nothing about the exterior invited curiosity. That was by design. The kind of clientele Jeoun served did not want to be found. They wanted to be known. There was a difference, and the restaurant had built its entire identity around understanding it. You received an invitation or you did not come. You signed a document before your first visit that no lawyer outside this world would have recognized as enforceable, but that every signatory understood completely. You did not discuss what you heard at other tables. You did not bring guests who had not been vetted. And you did not, under any circumstances, take photographs. Maya had learned all of this on her first day, delivered quietly by the floor manager, Mr. Shin, a small precise man in his 50s who spoke in the measured cadences of someone who had repeated these instructions many times and found them more important with each repetition. She had nodded at everything. She had signed the document without reading it closely, because the particulars mattered less than the fact of her signature, and she had understood that immediately. That had been 3 months ago. She was still here. Still invisible. Still, by every measure she could identify, surviving. The dining room itself was long and narrow, lacquered in black with warm amber lighting that turned every surface into something that glowed rather than reflected. 8 tables, never more than 6 guests per table, never more than 40 people in the room at full capacity. The kitchen was separated by a single swinging door and a philosophy. What happened in front remained entirely separate from what happened behind, and the staff were the membrane between those two worlds. Efficient, silent, present only when needed, absent the moment they were not. Maya was good at this. Better than good, if she was being honest with herself, which she tried to be, because self-deception was a luxury she had stopped being able to afford around the same time the pregnancy began to show. She had always been a reader of rooms. It was something she developed young, growing up in an Atlanta household where the atmosphere could shift without warning, and the ability to sense that shift before it arrived was not a skill but a survival mechanism. She knew how to watch without appearing to watch. She knew the difference between a table that wanted attentive service and a table that wanted to be left alone with the illusion of being attended to. She knew when a guest's glass needed refilling before the guest knew it themselves, and she knew how to deliver that refill without interrupting a sentence. Mr. Shin had noticed within the first week. He hadn't said anything directly, he was not a man who offered direct compliments, but he had moved her to the primary section, the tables closest to the center of the room, and that was language she understood. The other staff were harder to read. There were 6 of them on a full-service night, all Korean, all trained in the particular brand of professional invisibility that Ji-eun required. They were not unkind to Maya. They were careful with her, which was a different thing. Careful the way people are with someone carrying something fragile or dangerous or both. Hyun, the youngest server, sometimes brought her a bowl of rice from the staff meal without being asked and set it beside her without comment. The older servers made sure she took the tables with less lateral movement. No one asked about the pregnancy, about the father, about what a Black American woman was doing working a job like this in a city like Seoul. She did not volunteer the answers. They did not push. It was an arrangement that suited everyone. She arrived each shift 40 minutes early, set her section with the precision she'd been taught, reviewed the reservation notes Mr. Shin left in the leather folder by the service station, and prepared herself for whatever the evening required. Preparation was the only thing she could control. She had learned that too. Tonight, she picked up the leather folder at 6:47, 13 minutes before service began, and opened it to the reservation sheet for table 1. A guess. Private booking. Full menu, wine pairing, extended service window. Standard notation for the kind of evening that would run late and tip well and require absolute discretion. And at the top of the guest list, in Mr. Shin's careful handwriting, the name that made every server at Ji-eun stand a degree straighter and move a degree more quietly. Do-hyun Lee. Maya closed the folder. Set it back on the service station. Pressed her hand once, briefly, against her belly. Then she straightened her apron and went to work. They arrived at 7 on the exact minute, which told Maya something before anyone had spoken a word. Men who arrived early were anxious. Men who arrived late were performing. Men who arrived exactly on time had nothing to prove to the room, because the room had already arranged itself around the fact of their coming. Do-hyun Lee walked through the black lacquered door at 7 o'clock without checking his watch, because he had not needed to check his watch. He simply knew. Maya was at the service station when they came in, And she watched the way she always watched, peripherally, professionally, cataloging without staring. It was the first thing Mr. Shin had taught her. You see everything, you appear to see nothing. Do-hyun Lee was taller than she'd expected. Not imposing in the way that announced itself, not broad or loud or physically dominating, but tall in the way of someone whose presence filled space efficiently without waste. The suit was black, cut so precisely it seemed less like clothing and more like a second architecture laid over his frame. White shirt. Black tie. No pocket square, no cufflinks that caught the light, no detail designed to draw the eye. Everything about him said the same thing. I do not need your attention. I already have everything I require. His face was calm. That was the word Maya kept returning to as she watched him settle at the table. Not cold, not guarded, not the performed blankness of a man suppressing something. Genuinely calm. The way very still water is calm. Not empty, but deep in a way that made you careful about what you assumed was at the bottom. She had expected fear when she saw him. She was surprised to find something closer to clarity. Yoon-hee Lee took the seat to his left and the temperature in that corner of the room dropped 2 degrees. She was beautiful in the architectural way of someone who had made beauty into a discipline. Sharp cheekbones, hair swept back without a strand out of place, a dress the color of deep water that cost more than Maya's monthly rent. She settled into her chair with the ease of a woman who had never once in her life sat somewhere she did not belong, and she looked around the table once with eyes that assessed and filed and moved on. Her gaze passed over Maya at the service station the way it passed over the floral arrangement and the ambient lighting. Present. Noted. Irrelevant. Maya had been looked through before. She had grown up being looked through, had spent years in rooms where her presence registered as furniture rather than person. She had made her peace with it, mostly. Tonight she was grateful for it. Invisible was exactly what she needed to be. The other guests arranged themselves around the table in the unhurried way of people who understood that the geography of a dinner seating communicated its own information. 2 men in suits who arrived together and sat together, speaking in the low, efficient shorthand of people with shared history and shared interests. A woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most formidable person in any room, who assessed the table once and appeared satisfied. An older man who said very little and watched everything, which Maya recognized as its own kind of power. She was moving toward the table to begin the water service, her attention on the placement of the glasses, when she heard the laugh. It came from the far end of the table. Loud enough to carry without being loud enough to be called loud. The laugh of a man who had calibrated it precisely for rooms like this one, who knew how to perform ease without tipping into vulgarity. She knew that laugh. She had heard it across 100 different rooms over 18 months. She had heard it in the dark and in the morning and in the specific horrible register it took on when it was directed at her. She went completely still. Kang Seo-jin sat at the far end of the table, refilling his own wine glass from the bottle without waiting for service, finishing whatever joke he had told himself with the satisfied expression of a man who found his own company genuinely excellent. He was well-dressed, well-groomed, every surface of him presenting the same easy confidence that had convinced her, 18 months ago in a different city and a different version of her life, that he was exactly what he appeared to be. He had not looked toward the service station. He did not know she was there. Maya set the water pitcher down on the service station with a care that came entirely from the need to do something with her hands. Her heart was slamming. Her face was still. She had known, in the abstract, that he would be here tonight. She had heard him confirm it herself, 3 hours ago, in the wine cellar. Knowing a thing and seeing it were not the same. She breathed in once. Breathed out. Felt the slow roll of movement against her ribs, her child, present, steady, indifferent to the fear moving through her like cold water. She picked up the pitcher. She walked to the table. She began the service. She had met Seo-jin on a Tuesday in October, which felt important now only because of how ordinary it had been. A networking event at a hotel rooftop in Itaewon, the kind of gathering where everyone was performing a version of themselves they hoped would be believed. Maya had been in Seoul for 4 months by then, working a legitimate restaurant job, sending money home to her mother in Atlanta, building something that was supposed to be temporary and had started, quietly, to feel like a life. Seo-jin had been charming in the specific way of men who have practiced it, attentive without being intense, funny without trying too hard, interested in her in a way that felt, at the time, like being chosen. She had not been chosen. She understood that now. She had been identified. The relationship moved quickly, which she had told herself was a cultural difference, a pace thing, the natural acceleration of two people who recognized something in each other. He was generous. He was present. He talked about the future in the concrete, detailed way of someone who intended to build it with her, and she had believed him because she was 28 and tired, and the future he described, stability, a home, something permanent, was the one thing she had been trying to construct for herself since she was 17. She found out she was pregnant in February. He had said the right things. She had believed those too. The documents were in a folder inside a locked drawer of his home office desk, and she would never have found them if the drawer hadn't been left open by accident on a night he came home distracted and forgot his usual precision. She hadn't been looking for anything. She'd been looking for a pen. She still couldn't have told you exactly what everything in that folder meant. The language was technical, layered, written in the deliberate obscurity of people who needed records but not legible ones. But some things were clear enough. Money moving in quantities that had no legitimate explanation. Names she recognized from news coverage of criminal investigations that had gone nowhere. Photographs of men she didn't know in places she couldn't identify. And one document, in plain language, that described a series of arrangements between Seo-jin's operation and the Iron Crane Syndicate, payments made, services rendered, and a notation about a change in leadership that would be necessary, and the word necessary had been underlined once, by hand, in blue ink. She had put everything back exactly as she found it. She had gone to bed before he came upstairs. She had spent the night completely still beside him with her eyes open, her hand on her stomach, understanding that the version of her life she had been building did not exist and had never existed. He had not asked her to stay quiet. Asking would have implied she had a choice. Instead, 3 days later, after she made the mistake of asking a single careful question about something she had seen, he had explained the situation to her in the calm, methodical way he explained everything. What she knew. What he knew she knew. What happened to people who made poor decisions with that kind of information? He had not raised his voice. He had not touched her. He had simply described a set of consequences with the detached certainty of someone reading from a document, and then he had asked if she understood. She had said yes. She had left his apartment that night with a bag and never returned. The 3 months that followed were the most exhausting of her life, and she had not lived an easy life. She moved twice. She changed her phone. She worked jobs that paid cash and kept her off any system Seo-jin might think to check. Her body continued doing what it was doing regardless of the circumstances, growing, changing, making demands that fear could not override. She ate when she could. She slept badly. She carried the weight of what she knew the way you carry something with no safe place to set it down. Jeon had come through a woman named Clara, a Filipina server she'd met during a cash-in-hand catering shift, who'd heard they needed staff and mentioned it with the offhand practicality of someone passing on a bus route. The restaurant existed in a world that Seo-jin's reach hadn't mapped, because it was protected by the kind of power that made his operation look like a corner arrangement. She had understood that instinctively. The safest place to hide from a wolf was inside something the wolf was afraid of. She had been right about that. For 3 months, she had been invisible and safe. Until today. Until the wine cellar at 4 in the afternoon, restocking the second shelf, when she heard the kitchen door open behind her and recognized the voice before she turned around. Seo-jin, on the phone, not looking in her direction, speaking in the low efficient tone he used for business. Tonight. The private room. Lee Do-hyun. Before midnight. Confirm it. The pause. I'll be at the table. Make it clean. The door swung closed. He was gone. Maya stood between the wine racks with a bottle of Burgundy in each hand and understood, with the cold and absolute clarity of someone who has just run out of time, that the silence she had been surviving inside for 3 months was about to get someone killed. And that she was the only person in the building who knew it. The supply closet was 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep, and Maya had discovered in her 3 months at Jeoun that it was the one place in the building where you could stand alone without it appearing strange. Staff came in for linen, for backup glassware, for the small domestic requirements of a dining room mid-service. No one lingered. No one would think twice about a few minutes of absence if the timing was right. She had 3 minutes before the appetizer course needed to go out. She pulled the closet door shut behind her, reached up to the second shelf, and took down the linen order form that lived in a plastic sleeve beside the tablecloth inventory. The back was blank. She found a pen in her apron pocket, the same pen she used to note wine preferences and dietary requirements, and pressed the paper flat against the shelf with her palm. She wrote the first version quickly, the way you write when fear is driving and the need to act is louder than the need to think. There is a man at your table tonight who has arranged for you to be killed before midnight. I heard him confirm it this afternoon. His name is Kang Seo-jin and he has been working with your organization for 2 years and he is planning to take your position and I know because I was with him and I found documents and I have been hiding for 3 months and I need you to believe me and I need. She stopped. Read it back. Tore it into pieces small enough that no arrangement of them could be read. Desperation had a texture, and she had just put it in writing. A man like Do-hyun Lee received desperate communications regularly, she suspected. From people who wanted things, people who were afraid, people with angles and agendas barely concealed beneath their urgency. Desperation did not move men like that. It made them cautious. It made them slow. She wrote the second version with more control, paring it back to the essential facts. The name. The plan. The timing. 3 sentences. She read it back and understood the problem immediately. 3 sentences from an unknown source with no verification, no detail that distinguished real knowledge from rumor, no reason for him to believe she was anything more than a disruption or a plant. In the world he operated in, anonymous warnings were themselves a tactic. A way to destabilize. A way to redirect attention. He would not act on 3 sentences from a stranger. He would investigate, and investigating would take time they did not have. She tore the second version. The pieces joined the first on the closet floor. 2 minutes now, maybe less. She made herself stop. Made herself breathe. Put one hand flat against the shelf and felt the slight coolness of the wood and thought, with the deliberate focus of someone forcing their mind to work under pressure, about what would actually convince a man like him. Not emotion. Not volume. Not the full story, which was too long and too complicated and too easily dismissed as fabricated. One thing. One specific, verifiable detail that could only exist in the possession of someone with genuine knowledge. Something that was not rumor, not inference, not publicly available. Something that lived inside the Iron Crane's internal operations and nowhere else. She knew what it was. She had seen it in the folder, in the document written in plain language, the one with the underlined word. A code name used for the leadership transition. A location, not an address, a designation, 3 letters that meant something specific to the people who used them. And the time Seo-jin had confirmed on the phone this afternoon. 22 words. She counted them before she wrote them. The third version was those 22 words, nothing more. She read it back and felt, for the first time, that it was credible. That a man reading it would feel the specificity of real knowledge. That he would recognize the code name and understand immediately that whoever had written this had been close enough to see things that were not meant to be seen. She picked up the pen to fold it and her hand stopped. Because this was the moment. Not the delivery. The delivery was just movement, just mechanics. This was the actual decision, made here in a supply closet under a bare bulb with 2 minutes left and her child shifting against her ribs and every reasonable instinct she possessed telling her to put the paper down. She had spent 3 months being sensible. She had kept her head down and her mouth shut and her name off every system she could think of, and a man was still going to die tonight in the room she was responsible for serving, and she was the only person who could prevent it, and her child was going to be born into whatever world she left standing. Courage is not the absence of fear. She hadn't read that somewhere or been told it by someone wise. She had arrived at it alone, in this closet, at this moment, as a conclusion rather than a comfort. The fear was real and it was enormous and it was not going to go away. It was simply going to matter less than the alternative. She folded the note once, cleanly, along a single crease. She put it in her apron pocket. She picked up the tray. The dining room received her the way it always did, indifferently, completely, the ambient noise of conversation and crystal closing around her like water around a stone dropped into still surface. She had timed it for the transition between the appetizer and the main course, the natural moment of clearing and resetting when hands moved and attention shifted and a server's proximity to a guest was expected and unremarkable. She had thought about the timing in the closet, worked it through with the same methodical attention she gave to everything in this room, because the delivery mattered as much as the content and she was not going to have a second attempt. Maya moved to table 1 from the left side, the service approach. The direction guests were trained by repetition to expect staff to arrive from and therefore least likely to consciously register. She set the appetizer plate in front of Do-hyun Lee with her left hand, the motion smooth and practiced, the plate meeting the linen without a sound. Her right hand moved with it, the note between 2 fingers, and in the same continuous motion she slid it beneath the upper edge of the plate. Not under his hand, not placed anywhere that required him to acknowledge it, simply present, there, unmissable when he looked down. His hand moved. One motion. Deliberate, unhurried, the shift of a man adjusting his position at the table. His palm came to rest over the note with the naturalness of something entirely accidental, which meant it was not accidental at all. He did not look at her. She walked back to the kitchen. The door swung behind her and the dining room disappeared and she was back in the noise and heat of the kitchen, and she put both hands flat on the steel counter beside the pass-through and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, breathing. She did not know if he had read it yet. She did not know if he would read it at all, or if he would hand it to his security without looking at it, or if he would look at it and dismiss it, or if he would look at it and believe it and act, or if he would look at it and believe it and decide that the most efficient response was to remove the source of the information before it became a problem. She had considered that last possibility in the closet and set it aside, not because it was unlikely but because it was unactionable. There was nothing she could do about it. The note was passed. The decision was made. The only direction available now was forward. Jian appeared at her elbow with a plate. Main course for table 3. You okay? Fine, Maya said. Just needed a second. Jian looked at her the way she sometimes looked at her, with the careful sympathy of someone who had noticed more than she'd been told, and then moved on, because the kitchen didn't stop for anyone's internal weather. Maya straightened, picked up her order pad, went back to work. This was the part no one told you about. The before was fear, which was at least active. It moved through you, it demanded something, it had the momentum of approaching consequence. The after, the waiting, was its own specific category of suffering. Quieter than fear. More corrosive. The particular torment of having done the thing and now being required to behave as though you hadn't, to move through the normal choreography of a dinner service with a hammering heart and a face that showed nothing, because showing something was not an option. She cleared a plate from table 4. She refilled a water glass at table 6. She moved to the service station and reviewed the timing for the next course with the automatic competence of someone whose hands knew their work well enough to do it without supervision, which was fortunate because her mind was entirely somewhere else. At table 1, the conversation continued. She could hear it in fragments from the service station, the low register of men discussing things that mattered to them, the occasional measured response from Do-hyun, the performance of ease from people who were very good at performing it. Seo-jin's laugh, once, at something. The sound of it moved through her like a current and she absorbed it without reacting, which took more effort than anything she had done all evening. Do-hyun's hand was still resting on the table. She could not see, from this angle, whether the note was still beneath it or whether it had moved. She watched him the way she watched every guest, peripherally, briefly, reading without staring. His posture was unchanged. His expression was unchanged. He lifted his wine glass, set it down, responded to something the woman in deep blue said beside him with 2 words and a slight incline of his head. Nothing. No signal. No reaction. No indication that anything in the room had shifted. This was the unbearable part. That the bravest thing she had ever done, folded into 22 words on the back of a linen order form, might be sitting under a powerful man's palm being ignored while the clock moved toward midnight and Seojin refilled his glass at the far end of the table and nothing changed at all. Her child moved. Low and slow, a long rolling motion that pressed against her side and held there for a moment, warm and insistent, before releasing. She put one hand briefly against her apron. Then she picked up the next tray and carried it out. Do-hyun read the note 11 minutes after it was delivered. Not because he hadn't noticed it. He had registered it the moment the server's hand moved, had felt the slight pressure differential beneath his palm before she had fully withdrawn, had known with the peripheral certainty of someone trained from adolescence to notice the things people hoped went unnoticed that a folded piece of paper now existed under his hand where no folded piece of paper had been before. He had filed this information with the same calm efficiency with which he filed everything, and he had continued his conversation with Chairman Beck about the Incheon development without interruption, because the conversation with Chairman Beck required 3 more minutes of apparent engagement before it could be concluded gracefully and the note would still be there in 3 minutes. He was not a man who reacted. He was a man who responded. The difference between those two things had kept him alive for 11 years in a world designed to shorten lives. When he looked down, he did it inside a natural pause, reaching for his water glass, a slight shift of posture, the unremarkable fidget of a man settling more comfortably into his chair. His eyes dropped for 2 seconds. He read the note in its entirety. He set the water glass down and returned his attention to the table. 22 words. He did not look at the server. He did not look at Seojin. He did not change the arrangement of his face by a single degree. What he did, in the privacy of his own mind, was verify. The code name in the note was Chongja. It had been used internally for 11 days to refer to the structural reorganization of the syndicate's northern operations, a conversation that had taken place in a room with 4 people present, himself included, with no documentation outside a single encrypted file that 3 people in the world had access to. It was not a name that existed anywhere a person could stumble across it. It was not rumor, not inference, not the educated guess of someone who had been watching from the outside and assembled fragments into something plausible. Whoever had written this note had been inside. The location designation, 3 letters, a reference point used only in internal operational communications, confirmed it. The time matched what he already knew from his own security briefing this morning, a briefing that had flagged a possible external threat without identifying its source. 11 days. 11 days since Chongja had been named. He had 4 people to consider, minus himself. He began moving through them with the systematic efficiency of someone running a calculation rather than experiencing a betrayal, because emotion was a tool to be deployed deliberately and this was not the moment for it. He picked up his wine glass. Yoon-hee said something beside him, a dry observation about Chairman Beck's new architect that was, genuinely, precise enough to be funny, and Do-hyun smiled. Not performed. Actually smiled, because his wife was sharp in ways that still caught him, after 6 years, slightly off guard. He let her see that it landed. She would remember it later and it would matter in the way small true moments always mattered more than large constructed ones. Then, in the same motion of setting down his wine glass, he looked toward the far end of the room. Park Sung-jin, his head of security, stood at the service entrance in the civilian clothes he wore for nights like this, good suit, no earpiece visible, the studied posture of a man waiting for his party to finish. He had been there all evening. He was always there. He existed in rooms like this one the way load-bearing walls existed in buildings, invisibly, essentially, noticed only in their absence. Do-hyun looked at him for less than 1 second. It was enough. Sung-jin's eyes moved to the exits. Back to Do-hyun. A fraction of a nod, so small it could not have been read by anyone who hadn't spent years learning its vocabulary. The response, when it came, would come from Sung-jin. Do-hyun didn't need to instruct further. He had built his organization on the principle that the people around him should be capable enough to execute correctly from a single signal, and he had invested 11 years in making that principle operational. Explaining things at length was for people who hadn't hired correctly. He returned to the table. Asked Chairman Beck a question about the Incheon timeline that he already knew the answer to, because keeping Chairman Beck talking served his purposes for the next 20 minutes and because nothing about his behavior tonight could deviate from the expected. Across the table, Seojin was describing something to the woman on his left with animated confidence, his wine glass in hand, his face open and easy and entirely unguarded. Do-hyun watched him for exactly the length of time it took to reach a conclusion he had already suspected and now confirmed. Then he turned back to Chairman Beck and smiled, and the dinner continued, and the room around it began, invisibly, to change. Between the appetizer and the fish course, the sommelier changed. Maya noticed it because she noticed everything in this room. It was the habit that had kept her employed and invisible for 3 months, but she couldn't have said immediately what specifically had changed. The man at the service entrance wore the same uniform. He held the same leather-bound wine list. His posture was correct, his positioning standard. But something in the geometry of him was different, and it took her until she was back at the service station, reaching for the next tray, to understand what it was. The original sommelier, Mr. Huang, had a habit of holding the wine list slightly away from his body, the spine resting against the heel of his palm. The man at the door held it flush against his forearm, the way you hold something when your hands need to be free. She looked at him for 1 second. He was not looking at her. He was not looking at anyone in particular. He was watching the room in the unfocused, comprehensive way of someone who had been trained to watch rooms. She picked up her tray and went back to work, and she did not examine what she had noticed too closely, because examining it would require her to decide what it meant, and deciding what it meant would require her to believe that something was already happening, and believing that was more hope than she could afford to carry safely through the next 2 hours of service. The fish course went out at 8:40. Maya moved between tables with the practiced efficiency of someone whose body had learned this work well enough to perform it on its own, which left her mind free to register, in fragments and periphery, the small things that were not quite right. 2 men had taken seats at the bar area near the east exit sometime after 8. They had drinks. They were dressed correctly. They did not speak to each other, which was not impossible, but was unusual for 2 people who had chosen to sit adjacent. They faced slightly outward, away from each other, which gave them between them a complete view of the room. Not guests. A third man she didn't recognize had appeared in the kitchen during the fish course transition, speaking quietly with the head chef, who had nodded once and adjusted the timing on the next course by 4 minutes. She had been close enough to hear the 4 minutes. She had not been close enough to hear why. The net was closing. She could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm, not visible, not loud, but present in the air in a way that made her want to stand very still and breathe very carefully. At table 1, the dinner continued without interruption. Seojin was in the middle of a story about a deal he had closed in Tokyo, his hands moving to illustrate something, his voice carrying the warm self-assurance of a man who believed himself to be among the most interesting people in the room. The woman on his left was smiling with the polished attentiveness of someone who had learned to perform interest at events like this. He refilled his glass. He did not notice the man at the door who was not the sommelier. He did not notice the 2 men near the east exit. He did not notice anything, because he had decided 3 months ago what this evening was and how it would end, and that decision had made him incurious about everything that didn't confirm it. This is what unchecked confidence costs you. Maya had watched Seojin operate for 18 months, and she understood his particular blindness precisely. He was good at reading threats that presented themselves directly. He was not good at reading rooms, because reading rooms required humility about what you might have missed, and humility was not a quality he had ever found necessary. Yoon-hee had found it necessary. Maya could see that from across the room. Do-hyun's wife sat with the same composed elegance she had maintained all evening, but something in her attention had shifted. She was watching her husband with the subtle, practiced focus of a woman who had spent years learning to read a man who gave very little away. Do-hyun was quieter than usual, not silent, not withdrawn, but operating at a frequency slightly below his social baseline, contributing precisely what the conversation required and nothing additional. Yoon-hee glanced toward the service entrance once, then toward the bar. Her expression did not change, but her posture settled in a way that suggested she had cataloged something and filed it under a category she would return to later. She reached for her water glass and said something light to the woman beside her, and the moment passed. Maya finished clearing table 6 and returned to the service station and looked at the clock above the kitchen door. 9:14. Less than 3 hours to midnight. The most dangerous things she was learning did not announce themselves. They simply arrived, fully formed, after a period of invisible preparation during which everything looked exactly as it was supposed to look. She straightened her apron. She picked up the next tray. And she carried it out into a room that was already, quietly and completely, no longer what it appeared to be. Yoon-hee had married a man who never told her everything, and she had made her peace with that in the first year and built her life around it in the years that followed. This was not, as people who didn't understand their marriage sometimes assumed, a resignation. It was a recognition. Do-hyun kept his own counsel not because he didn't trust her but because compartmentalization was the architecture of his survival, and dismantling it for the sake of marital transparency would have been like removing load-bearing walls to improve the view. She had understood this before she accepted his proposal. She had understood it more completely with every year that passed. What she had learned instead was to read the negative space. Not what he said, but what he left out. Not his expressions, which were controlled to the point of being nearly useless as information, but the micro-adjustments that surrounded them. The particular quality of his stillness. The rate at which he reached for his water glass. The difference between the silence of a man who was present and the silence of a man who was elsewhere, processing something she hadn't been shown. Tonight, Do-hyun was elsewhere. She had noticed it before the fish course. A slight reduction in his conversational output, not enough for anyone unfamiliar with his baseline to register, but she had been calibrating against his baseline for 6 years and the deviation was clear to her. He was present enough to satisfy the table. He was not fully present. Some portion of his attention was engaged with something that had nothing to do with Chairman Baek's opinions on the Incheon waterfront. She did not ask. She never asked directly, because direct questions in moments like this produced careful non-answers that told her less than observation did. She watched instead and catalogued, and waited for the shape of the thing to become clear. The sommelier was wrong. She clocked it sometime around the fish course. Not the uniform, not the positioning, but the eyes, which were doing something different from what a sommelier's eyes did. She noted it without reacting and moved her attention onward. The 2 men at the bar were not there for drinks. She had decided this within 4 minutes of their arrival and confirmed it by watching the rate at which their glasses diminished, which was very slow for men sitting at a bar and entirely consistent with men who needed to appear to be sitting at a bar. Something was happening. Something had been set in motion here, tonight, in this room, by her husband. She was certain of it the way she was certain of weather, not through a single indicator but through the accumulation of small atmospheric shifts that individually meant nothing and together meant everything. She looked around the table with the relaxed, social attention of a woman engaged in pleasant conversation, which was the most useful cover she possessed. Chairman Baek? She knew him well. Nothing unusual in his manner tonight. He was exactly what he always was, ambitious, careful, performing a warmth he didn't entirely feel. Not the source of whatever this was. The woman in deep blue, whose name she had been given and immediately associated with her husband's shipping interests. Unremarkable. Not the source. Seojin at the far end of the table, laughing again. Yoon-hee had met Seojin 4 times over 2 years. She had never liked him, which was not unusual. There were many people in her husband's world she didn't like, but her dislike of Seojin had a specific quality she had never fully examined. He was too comfortable, too assured in a way that wasn't earned by the position he actually held. Men who laughed that freely in rooms like this one were either very safe or very foolish, and Seojin did not strike her as very safe. She filed that beside the sommelier and the men at the bar and her husband's fractional absence and let the pattern sit at the edge of her mind where it could assemble itself without being forced. Then her gaze moved to the service station and stopped. The pregnant waitress. She had registered her earlier in the evening, the only foreigner on staff, visibly near term, moving through the room with a quiet competence that he had noted and set aside. Nothing unusual. Staff at Joon were vetted. Mr. Shin did not make careless hires. But she was looking at the woman now with the particular attention of someone whose pattern recognition had just connected something, and what she was connecting was this. The change in Do-hyun had begun during the appetizer course. The appetizer course had been delivered by this woman. And this woman, standing at the service station with one hand briefly against her pregnant belly, was watching the dining room with eyes that were not the eyes of someone thinking about the next tray. They were the eyes of someone waiting for something they had already set in motion. Yoon-hee held her gaze there for 3 seconds longer than was polite, though the woman wasn't looking at her and wouldn't have known. Then she reached for her wine glass and returned to her conversation and said nothing, because saying something was premature, and premature conclusions were a form of carelessness she did not permit herself. But she did not stop watching. The dessert course was cleared at 10:47. Maya moved through it with the automatic precision of someone whose body had learned to work independently of whatever her mind was doing, which tonight was useful, because her mind had been somewhere between the service station and table 1 for the past 3 hours and showed no signs of returning. She collected plates. She reset the linen. She poured the digestive for table 3 with a steady hand and accepted the compliment from the guest at table 5 about the evening's pacing with a small nod and moved on. At table 1, the mood had shifted into the particular register of a dinner approaching its natural conclusion. The formal business of the evening was done. She could tell by the way the bodies had relaxed, the way conversations had become more personal, less constructed, the way glasses were being refilled with the ease of people no longer performing for each other but simply finishing something pleasant. Chairman Beck was telling a story from his early career that had the rhythm of something often told. The woman in deep blue was laughing at it genuinely. Even the older man who had said very little all evening had unbuttoned the top button of his jacket. Seo-jin was on his 3rd digestive. His tie was loosened by a centimeter. He had the expansive, settled quality of a man who believed the evening had gone exactly as planned and was now simply waiting for it to end so the next thing could begin. Maya stood at the service station and watched the clock above the kitchen door and did not allow herself to think about what happened if nothing changed in the next hour and 13 minutes. Do-hyun had said 4 words during the dessert course. She had counted without meaning to. He had accepted a compliment from Chairman Beck about the syndicate's recent northern expansion with a single sentence. He had responded to something Yoon-hee said with 2 words and a look that carried more than the words did. Otherwise he had been quiet in the way that had become, over the course of the evening, its own kind of presence at the table. A stillness so complete that the conversation flowed around it naturally, the way water moves around a stone. He set his fork down at 10:51. Not the end of a course. The dessert had been cleared 4 minutes earlier. Simply set it down on the linen beside his coffee cup, with the deliberate placement of a man finishing something internal rather than something on a plate. He picked up his coffee. He held it without drinking. Chairman Beck was reaching the conclusion of his story. The punchline landed. Laughter moved around the table in the warm, relaxed way of people who had eaten well and drunk enough and were genuinely comfortable in each other's company. And then Do-hyun set down his coffee cup. He looked down the length of the table. Seo-jin. 1 word. His own name said back to him by a man who used names the way other men used furniture. Only when necessary, always in exactly the right place. The laughter didn't stop immediately. It completed itself, the way a sound completes itself after the source has ceased, a half-second of momentum carrying it forward before the silence caught up. Then it stopped. It was the quality of Do-hyun's voice that did it. Not loud. Not cold, exactly. Something more precise than cold. The tone of a man for whom the conversation that followed had already been decided, was already complete in every meaningful sense, and what remained was simply the formality of conducting it aloud. There was no question in it. There was no threat in it. There was only the absolute, unhurried certainty of someone who had already arrived at the destination and was waiting, with limitless patience, for everyone else to catch up. Chairman Beck's glass paused on its way to his lips and stayed there. The woman in deep blue looked at Do-hyun and then at Seo-jin and then back at Do-hyun with the expression of someone recalibrating. The older man who had said very little all evening went very still in a way that suggested he had spent enough time in rooms like this one to understand precisely what a voice like that, saying a name like that, at a moment like this, meant. Yoon, he set down her cup without sound and folded her hands in her lap and looked at her husband with the calm attention of a woman whose pattern had just finished assembling itself. Seojin smiled. It was the smile of a man buying time, the social reflex of someone whose instincts had registered danger before his conscious mind had caught up to it. Do-hyun. What? Just your name, Do-hyun said. I haven't asked you anything yet. The silence that followed was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a full one, 8 people, the ambient hum of a city outside, the distant sound of the kitchen, all of it present and all of it somehow absent, swallowed by the quality of attention that had descended on the table like a physical weight. Wine glasses were still mid-air. No one moved to set them down. No one moved at all. At the service station, Maya gripped the edge of the counter with both hands and felt the silence land in her chest like something she had been carrying for 3 months finally setting itself down. It had begun. Do-hyun did not open with the accusation. He opened with a question about the Incheon development, which he directed at Chairman Beck with the same measured courtesy he had used all evening, and for 3 seconds the table didn't understand what was happening. Then Chairman Beck answered, haltingly, and Do-hyun nodded and said that was consistent with what he understood, and then he said that it was interesting, because the timeline Chairman Beck had just described overlapped precisely with a series of internal communications that had been redirected without authorization beginning 11 days ago, and he wondered if Chairman Beck had been aware of that. Chairman Beck had not been aware of that. Do-hyun nodded again. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down without looking for a refill. He said that was what he had thought. He said it in the tone of a man confirming something rather than discovering it, which was the most frightening thing about the way he spoke. Everything he said had the quality of already being known, already being settled, the conversation merely the procedure of making it visible to others. Seojin said his name again. Do-hyun. Steadier this time, the smile recalibrated into something more serious, more collegial. The tone of a man attempting to enter the conversation as a participant rather than a subject. Whatever you've heard, I think there's been a... I haven't told you what I've heard yet, Do-hyun said. The smile stayed on Seojin's face for a moment after it had ceased to mean anything. Then it left. Do-hyun set both hands flat on the table and looked at Seojin the way he had looked at him all evening, directly, without heat, without the performed anger that lesser men used as a substitute for actual power. He began to speak. He spoke for 6 minutes. Maya would not be able to reconstruct all of it afterward. Some of it was in the operational language of a world she understood only partially, names and designations and transaction references that meant nothing to her but clearly meant a great deal to everyone else at the table. But the shape of it was clear. The money that had moved. The communications that had been intercepted. The external contract, its terms, its timeline, its intended outcome. The code name. The location. The time. With each piece, Seojin's face moved through its stages with the involuntary honesty of a man whose control was failing faster than he could compensate. Denial first, the slight widening of the eyes, the almost imperceptible backward shift, the instinct to create distance from the words. Then confusion, which was not real confusion but the performance of it, the attempt to use puzzlement as a shield. Then calculation, the eyes going briefly inward, running scenarios, looking for the exit, finding each one already sealed. Maya recognized that stage. She had seen it on his face once before in a different context, and she had learned then what it meant. It meant he already knew he had lost and was deciding how much of himself to spend on the pretense that he hadn't. The blankness that followed was the most honest thing she had ever seen on Seojin's face. It was the expression of a man who had arrived at the end of a road he had believed was longer than this and found there was nothing beyond it. The other guests did not move. Chairman Beck had set his glass down sometime during the 2nd minute and had not picked it up again. The woman in deep blue sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the table between her and Seojin with the careful stillness of someone who understood that in rooms like this one, at moments like this one, the correct behavior was absolute neutrality. The older man who had said very little all evening was watching Do-hyun with something that might, in a different context, have been called respect. No one fled. No one interrupted. This was the protocol of the world they all inhabited, when the most powerful man in the room began to speak in that particular register, you did not leave, you did not intervene, you witnessed, because witnessing was both mandatory and, in its way, protective. To witness was to be present, and to be present was to be known to have been present, and being known to have been present on the correct side of a moment like this was its own form of currency. Do-hyun finished. The room held its silence. Then he said, in the same level voice he had used for everything else, that the information had come to him this evening through a source he had not previously known and had not expected. He said the source had taken a considerable personal risk to deliver it. He said the source was currently standing at the service station beside the kitchen door. Every head at the table turned. Maya did not move. She was gripping the edge of the counter with both hands, her weight slightly forward, her apron still damp from the evening service, her ponytail coming loose on the left side where it always came loose by the end of a long shift. 7 months pregnant and exhausted and terrified in a way that had not diminished simply because the thing she had feared was now happening. Seo-jin looked at her. She had imagined this moment many times in the past 3 hours, and in each version she had looked away. She did not look away. She held his gaze across the length of the dining room with the steadiness of someone who had already spent everything they had on this and had nothing left to protect by flinching. His face did something she hadn't expected. Not rage. Not the cold threat she knew from the apartment, from the careful explanations of consequence. Something smaller and more final. The recognition of a man understanding precisely where the breach had been, and how long it had been open, and what it had cost him. Do-hyun spoke one more time. He said that was all. Sung-jin and 2 men Maya hadn't seen enter the room moved to Seo-jin's chair with the quiet efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this signal. And the silence, which had descended like a physical thing and held the room in its weight for the past 6 minutes, finally, slowly, began to release. Do-hyun said wait. Not loudly. Not with the particular authority he used when volume was required, because volume was rarely required and tonight less than ever. He said it in the same register he had used for everything else, and Sung-jin stopped with the same efficiency with which he had begun moving, and the 2 men beside him stopped, and Seo-jin remained in his chair with the stillness of someone who had run the remaining calculations and understood that stillness was the only option left with any return. Do-hyun pushed back his chair. He stood. He buttoned the single button of his jacket with the habitual precision of a man who had done it 10,000 times and did it the same way each time regardless of what surrounded him. Then he walked the length of the dining room toward the service station with the same unhurried pace he brought to everything, and the room watched him go in the particular silence of people who had learned tonight that watching carefully was its own form of participation. Maya did not move. There was nowhere to move to, and besides, her legs had gone somewhat unreliable in the past few minutes, and she trusted the counter beneath her hands more than she trusted her own body to carry her anywhere with dignity. He stopped in front of her. Close enough to speak quietly. Far enough that the distance was respectful. The distance of a man who understood that a woman who had spent 3 months being threatened might have a calibrated sensitivity to proximity, and who had adjusted accordingly without being asked. He looked at her directly. Not the way he had looked at Seo-jin, which had been the gaze of a man conducting an assessment of something he intended to dismantle. This was different. More considered. The look of someone who had just received a significant debt and was attempting to understand the full dimensions of what he owed before deciding how to discharge it. He said, "What do you want?" 4 words. No preamble, no context, no performance of gratitude. Just the question, asked with the directness of a man who had found that the most efficient path between 2 people was usually a straight line. Maya had rehearsed this. In the supply closet, during the fish course, during the long suspended minutes of the dessert service, she had run through versions of this conversation with the compulsive thoroughness of someone trying to prepare for every possible direction. She had considered asking for money, which she needed. She had considered asking for documentation, legal protection, something formal and binding that couldn't be withdrawn. She had considered asking for passage home to Atlanta, which some part of her had wanted since February. She opened her mouth and none of those things came out. "I don't want him to be able to do this to anyone else," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected, which surprised her enough that she continued. "Not just me. Not just what he did to me specifically. The way he operates. The way he finds people who are vulnerable and isolated and uses that. I want that to be over. I want there to be a record somewhere that makes it over. Do-hyun was listening with the complete attention of someone for whom listening was a discipline rather than a courtesy. And my child, Maya said. I need my child to be born into something that isn't. She stopped, looked for the right word, found it. Contaminated by him. By his reach. By the fact that he knows who I am and where I am and has spent 3 months making sure I understood what that meant. She had not planned to say the next part. It arrived on its own, from somewhere below the rehearsed versions, from the place where the true things lived that she had spent 3 months not allowing herself to voice. I spent 3 months believing that what I knew didn't matter because of who I was. That no one would believe a pregnant black waitress with no connections in a country that isn't hers over a man like him. She held his gaze. I need to know that I was wrong about that. That what I did tonight, that it counted. That it was enough. The dining room was quiet behind her. She was aware of it distantly, the way you are aware of weather outside a window. Present, noted, not immediate. Do-hyun was quiet for a moment that was not uncomfortable. Because it was not the silence of a man searching for something to say but the silence of a man giving weight to what he had heard before he responded to it. Then he nodded. The nod of a man making a commitment rather than offering a pleasantry, the kind of nod that in his world meant the same thing as signature meant in others. It counted, he said. He said it the way he said everything, without decoration, without the performed warmth that would have made it feel smaller. Just the words, level and certain, delivered by a man who did not say things he didn't mean because the cost of saying things he didn't mean was a currency he had never been willing to spend. Maya felt something release in her chest that had been held so long she had stopped being aware of its tension. Not relief, exactly. Something older than relief. The particular easing of a person who has been braced for a long time against something that is no longer coming. Her child moved. Long and slow, the familiar role she had come to read as its own language, unhurried, steady, present. She put one hand against her apron and breathed. Do-hyun watched her do it with an expression she couldn't fully read but that contained, she thought, something she hadn't expected to find in a room like this, in a man like him, on a night like this one. Something that looked, quietly and without announcement, like respect. The dining room emptied slowly, the way rooms empty after something significant has occurred in them, not all at once, but in the careful, measured departures of people who understand that how you leave a room like this matters almost as much as how you behaved inside it. Chairman Beck had gone first, after a brief exchange with Do-hyun that Maya hadn't heard and hadn't tried to hear. He had not looked at her on his way out. The woman in deep blue had paused at the door and looked back once, not at Do-hyun, not at the chair where Seo-jin had been sitting, but at Maya, with an expression that was unreadable and brief and somehow, in its brevity, more than nothing. The older man had left without a word to anyone, which Maya suspected was entirely consistent with who he was. The kitchen staff had been dismissed at 11. Mr. Shin had appeared at Maya's elbow sometime after that and told her, in his quiet, precise way, that she could go, that her shift was complete, that a car had been arranged. She had nodded and not moved and he had accepted this without comment and left her there. Sung-jin had guided her, eventually, to a chair near the service station, not a dining chair, a staff chair, brought from the back, and brought her a glass of water and a plate of food from the kitchen that she ate without tasting because her body had finally remembered it had been running on almost nothing since noon. She had sat there while the room was cleared around her, quiet, her hand on her belly, watching the black lacquered walls give back the amber light in the way they always did, unchanged by everything that had happened inside them. Seo-jin had not looked at her again after the first time. She was grateful for that. By 11:40 the room was empty except for Do-hyun and Yoon-hee at the center table, and Maya at the service station, and the understanding, unspoken but clear, that she was not yet meant to leave. She watched them without watching them, in the way she had learned. They sat across from each other in the guttered candlelight, the detritus of the evening's service cleared away, the table between them bare except for 2 small glasses of something amber that Yoon-hee had poured from a bottle she had taken from the bar herself. Yoon-hee spoke first. Her voice was low enough that Maya caught only the shape of the question, not its content, but she didn't need the content. She had been in rooms long enough to read what conversations were about from their architecture. This was a question that had been held all evening and was only now being released. Do-hyun answered. Longer than he usually spoke, she had calibrated his verbal rhythms over the course of the evening, and this was outside them, which told her the answer required more than his usual economy. He spoke for perhaps 2 minutes. Yoon-hee listened without interrupting, which Maya had come to understand was not passivity but the active, disciplined attention of someone who knew the value of receiving information completely before responding to it. Then silence. Yoon-hee looked at the table. She picked up her glass and held it without drinking, the way she held things when she was thinking rather than drinking. She asked something else. Shorter. Maya caught the cadence of it. A question about a specific subject, directed and deliberate. Do-hyun's answer this time was brief. 4 or 5 sentences. He gestured slightly with one hand toward the service station, the smallest possible indication of direction, and did not look over, and Maya understood that she had just been described. Yoon-hee was quiet again. Longer this time. Maya watched her in the peripheral, careful way, the stillness of her posture, the way her thumb moved once against the glass, the slight change in the set of her shoulders that suggested something internal had shifted, some arrangement of feeling or understanding or both had completed itself and arrived at a conclusion. When Yoon-hee spoke again, her voice was different. Still low, still controlled, but carrying something it hadn't carried before. Maya couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to hear the words. She could read in the quality of Do-hyun's response, the slight pause before it, the way he looked at his wife for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on his face all evening, that whatever Yoon-hee had said had surprised him. Not destabilized. Not unsettled. Surprised, in the specific way of a man who has been married long enough to believe he has fully mapped his wife's interior landscape, encountering something that reminds him the map is always incomplete. He nodded. Slowly. The same nod he had given Maya earlier, the commitment rather than the courtesy, and reached across the bare table and covered Yoon-hee's hand with his. She let him. They sat like that for a moment, in the amber light of a room that had held a great deal tonight and was now, finally, quiet. Then Yoon-hee looked up and across the room and found Maya at the service station with a directness that was nothing like the way she had looked through her earlier in the evening. This was not the gaze that passed over furniture. This was the gaze of a woman who had spent years understanding the difference between people who acted when it mattered and people who didn't, and had just placed Maya firmly in the former category. She held it for 2 seconds. Then she inclined her head. Small, precise, unmistakable. Not an apology. Something more valuable than an apology. An acknowledgement, offered by a woman who did not offer them carelessly, from one person to another across the length of a room that had asked a great deal of both of them tonight. Maya received it in the spirit it was given. Outside, through the single high window above the service station, the city continued its indifferent business. Somewhere in it, the night was moving toward morning. Her child shifted once against her ribs, settled, and was still. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate in a way she couldn't fully articulate. It was sitting inside her building's mail slot when she came down at 8 in the morning, 3 weeks after the dinner at Jeoun, sandwiched between a utility statement and a flyer for a dry cleaning service she had never used. Plain white envelope, her name written in careful print by someone who was not the return address. There was no return address, and thick in the way of documents rather than letters. She took it upstairs. She set it on the small kitchen table beside her tea and looked at it for a moment before opening it, because she had learned over the past 3 weeks to give herself a moment before things, to not move through her days at the pace that fear set, which was always faster than necessary. The legal paperwork was 12 pages. She read all of it, slowly, at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window at the angle it came through at this hour, falling across the table in a way that made the pages easy to read without straining. The language was formal and dense, and she parsed it with the careful attention of someone who had learned that documents rewarded reading completely. A trust. Established in her child's name. Funded by an anonymous donor. The paperwork used that phrase with the clean, unelaborated simplicity of something that had been designed to be exactly as informative as intended and no more. The amount was sufficient, the documents explained in their careful language, to cover educational expenses, housing security, and medical costs for a period of 20 years from the date of the child's birth. 20 years. She sat with that for a moment. The card was at the back, behind the last page of documentation. Small, cream-colored, the kind of card that came from a place that understood quality as understatement. No letterhead. No signature. 4 words in the same careful print as the envelope. You spoke. We listened. Maya set it down on the table and put both hands flat on either side of it and looked at it in the morning light. She had thought, in the weeks since the dinner, about what she had expected to feel when something like this arrived. If something like this arrived, which she had not allowed herself to fully believe it would. She had thought she might cry, which was not something she did easily or often. She had thought she might feel the particular complicated emotion of someone who has received help from a source they cannot reciprocate or fully trust, which was its own thing, its own mixture of gratitude and discomfort. What she actually felt was simpler than either of those. She felt the specific, quiet relief of a weight being set down. Not dramatically. Not all at once. The way a long-carried thing is set down when you finally reach somewhere safe enough to put it. Gradually, with the bodily awareness of muscles releasing tension they had been holding so long they had stopped registering it as tension. She was safe. Her child would be born safe. The shadow that had followed her since February, that she had carried through 2 apartments and a job change and 3 months of careful, exhausting invisibility, was gone. Seoul had been in the news twice in the past 3 weeks. She had read both articles with the careful attention of someone verifying rather than discovering. The first had been brief, a criminal investigation, sources unnamed, charges pending. The second, 4 days later, had been longer, the kind of article that had clearly been written from detailed information provided by someone who wanted things documented publicly. She had read it once, set her phone down, and not returned to it. It was enough to know. She did not need the details. She folded the card once along its crease and held it in her hand for a moment. Then she put it inside the envelope with the documents and put the envelope in the small box on the shelf above her desk where she kept the things that mattered. Her passport, her mother's letters, the photograph from her first week in Seoul when she had still believed it was going to be a simple story. She put on her coat. It no longer buttoned across her belly, which she had accepted sometime in the past week as simply one of the current facts of her body, like the ache in her lower back and the way she moved more slowly on stairs. The new job had come through a phone call 10 days ago. A restaurant in Mapo, real, public, listed, the kind of place that had reviews and a sign on the door and a staff who had been told, she gathered from the welcome she received on her first visit, to expect her and to treat her accordingly. Front of house manager. The hours were reasonable. The kitchen respected the floor, which was rarer than it should have been and which she had learned over years to identify within the first 20 minutes of being in a building. She had started 5 days ago. She had spent those 5 days doing what she did in every room she entered, reading it, learning it, understanding what it needed before it asked. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She picked up her bag. She checked the window lock the way she checked it every morning. Not from fear now but from the simple habit of someone who took care of the space she lived in. She put one hand briefly against her belly, the familiar gesture, the check-in, the acknowledgement of the presence that had been her most constant companion through all of it. Her child turned once, slow and deliberate, the movement that she had come to read as its own form of greeting. She opened the door. The hallway was quiet, the building still in the early morning way of a place where most people were not yet moving. The stairwell smelled like someone's coffee, already brewing 1 floor up, and outside the building's front door the city was doing what cities do, continuing, indifferent, full of its own noise and business and the 10,000 private stories of people moving through it. She stepped out into the morning. Not transformed. Not rescued in the way stories usually rescued people, with the dramatic reversal and the new identity and the life that bore no resemblance to the one before. She was still Maya Thompson, still a Black American woman in a city that was not her own, still carrying a child whose first weeks of life would be shaped by decisions made in apartments and wine cellars and supply closets and a black-lacquered dining room at 10:51 on a Thursday night. But she was free of the thing that had followed her. And her child would be born into a world where the man who had tried to make silence permanent had instead become a lesson in the cost of underestimating people. She had written 22 words on the back of a linen order form. She had folded it once. She had walked back into the room. Sometimes that is all courage is. Not the grand gesture, not the dramatic confrontation, not the moment that looks like bravery from the outside. Sometimes it is a folded piece of paper and the decision, made alone in a supply closet under a bare bulb, that someone else's life is worth more than your own fear. She walked toward the subway. The morning light was very clean.